Okay,
All right,
Megan
let's
says,
go
let's
ahead.
just jump in. So, welcome. Thanks for tuning in to Closing Bell. We will get this released. Looks like slightly off schedule on the live feed, but if you're watching from there, thanks for the patience. Trey, how's your life going, man?
Well, life is something. I mean, it makes sense that we're having some technical difficulties because I feel like the whole world is having technical difficulties. But we are stepping into a really, at least generally, historically happy weekend with Halloween. Now, I did do a little bit of research on Halloween, and unfortunately, Halloween does not look as promising this year. So here's an infographic that we published in Choices Magazine, which is an AAEA affiliated outlet, where we were basically trying to understand how many people out there are actually going to participate in their regular Halloween activities. And it looks like, at least when we collected the data, that about half the people out there are probably not going to do what they usually do. And another 26-ish% of the people are also, or at least at the time, were very uncertain about what they were going to do. So all in all, Halloween looks like a bummer, just like everything else in 2020. That's our life now.
I do know that my kids are gonna do at least like a bubble ween, where we're going to a couple good friends' houses, and then we'll come back and just descend upon the candy that night.
Well, I guess it depends on how you look at candy, because it could be that that's actually a good thing for health. About 42% of our samples said they plan on eating less Halloween candy than years prior. So, I mean, I
So
don't know.
there is that positive, but
It's also a negative.
there's also exercise negative, at least for my kids. We've been trapped in here and gone through every Disney show that possibly exists. So you're right. There's less candy, but there's also less exercise involved with it.
That's true. Yeah. So, mixed bag, but unfortunately, it's probably net
The bag
negative.
we have.
Yeah. So, this week, we had gotten into a couple weeks ago a conversation about social capital, and Dr. Lindy Robeson from Michigan State University was talking us through some of his research on social relationships and how relationships are really important in economics. And it immediately kind of dawned on me that we're stepping into this important political moment where, I mean, at least for me personally, I've never felt as anxious or nervous or just in life, but also because of the election. You can't get away from it. And so immediately what I thought was, maybe we should have somebody on that's more of a political scientist who can speak to some of the, I think, bigger questions that all of us are having right now about, I don't know, the current situation that we're finding ourselves, and maybe the future of what politics might look like into the long term. So with that, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest, who literally wrote the book on I think probably the most salient difference in at least this election in my life relative to so many other elections. So his book's titled American Rage, which is, I think, a very important thing that we can probably all identify with right now. So Stephen, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's good to be here.
So you've been literally all over the place in terms of like the content that you've been generating, but also just the interviews you're doing. I Google searched you earlier, and I was going to like put in all the different places that you've been featured in, but it was just like way too many places. So I thought I would just at least highlight your conversation article from a couple months back. So the conversation is this really nice academic outlet for popular press stuff. It was, I think you did a really great job in there of synthesizing some of your work and some of political science's work on the current feeling in the world. Yeah. So do you want to at least kind of introduce yourself a little bit more? What am I missing here?
Man, I think probably the most important thing is that shirt I'm wearing there, the Oklahoma State guy, just like you. So that's, really the first thing we got to get out of the way there.
Stephen, I was going to ask a question about that picture since you bring it up. Is that a picture you sent Trey, or did he just not spend very long on his Google search of you?
No,
literally
I think
the
Trey
first
was
photo,
creeping on me, maybe.
Literally the first photo on your Twitter account.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
It just, so you know what
staring
this is.
straight into the sun, and you're unhappy about it.
It was bad, man. I was trying to pretend I'm an Indiana football fan,
Okay.
which I mean they beat Penn State, so that was cool.
Yeah.
I wish I felt some sort of joy about that, but I'm working my way up. I'll fake it till I make it. So yeah, in case my employer is listening to this, I am a professor at Indiana University. Go Hoosiers! Still not sure what a Hoosier is, but
nice save, man.
yeah. So I study what's called political psychology or political behavior. So what people think about politics and how those thoughts affect their behavior. And a lot of my focus is on the sort of growing negativity in American politics. And in particular, I focus on anger, how politicians elicit anger, why they do this, and sort of what its effects are on the things we believe and the things we do in terms of politics.
Yeah, that feels like the most important topic that anybody could be covering right now. So, I mean, no wonder you're literally everywhere.
I mean, there's certainly more pressing things, but I do think that, this explains a lot about politics. I mean, I live pretty close to the early voting center here in Bloomington, and no matter whether it's 6:30 in the morning, people are lining up. Doesn't matter if it's pouring down rain. We're in the middle of COVID-19, and there's still long lines to vote. And I think that's because people are angry about politics, and they're angry for various reasons. But it's this anger that's sort of pushing them off the sidelines and getting them to the polls. So I do think that this is something that does a lot in terms of explaining the political world we find ourselves in.
Can I ask about that? So Trey said he's feeling more, I don't know, I think he said anxious about this election than any in the recent past. I certainly feel the same. Yeah. Is it the case that this election is kind of different in terms of how polarized we are than the past, or is it just that this is sort of a coming of age election for Trey and I?
I mean, I think it's been a steady march. It's not like we were in a period of no polarization and then we kind of flipped a switch and we're polarized. It's been sort of a gradual, or, as the sort of lingo in political science, we might say a secular change, right? It's been these slow developments. I think, we're kind of at the perhaps the pinnacle of this, right? This is sort of a perfect cocktail of ingredients that have made us angry. And as you both had mentioned, you're anxious about this. So, I don't think it's the case that we weren't angry or anxious in previous years. But I think this year is, we're kind of turning the dial up to 11 here. And it's important to note that this is true on both sides, whether left, right, Democrat, Republican, there's lots of anger. It's sort of a bipartisan emotion right now. One of the few things actually that we probably could say is bipartisan.
That's an interesting point. I think so. Your first chapter, you do an introduction in your book, and then you jump into this conversation about elites and the role of elites in this polarization or anger feature. And I mean, that to me feels like something that has always been a thing, right? That people distrust the elites in the United States. But I think in my mind, what's changing is what people define as elites now, or I don't know. This conversation about elites is something that I think really does merit a lot of conversation.
But I mean, he's the expert. I'm gonna let him talk. But I feel like the word itself, elite, has changed from being something that has value to being almost like a dirty word. Someone who's so far removed, they think they're better than us, rather than kind of somebody who's pulled himself up by his bootstraps and has bettered himself.
It's certainly a word that has some interesting connotations to it. Most of them, I think, as you're alluding to, Alex, are sort of negative connotations. In political science, we generally think that elites are people like elected officials, so members of Congress. I think a lot of people, would sort of broaden that definition and say it's anybody who has a real platform that could shape public opinion. So that sort of definition lets you put in media figures like a Sean Hannity or a Rachel Maddow, if that's your, persuasion. I think it's not entirely clear all the time what elites are or who they are. I think the key distinction is that however we define it, they're different from the mass public. So the people who just turn up to vote. But this is again, you go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering you're saying they are different than. I wonder how much of that is used as a ploy to say this is a them, there's a us versus them thing, these people. So I think of this as kind of an academia ivory tower. They're so
Yeah.
far out of touch with reality. They don't know what the lives of everyday people are. That's a criticism that a lot of politicians get. They're just so far out of touch with everyday reality. Is that?
So I think there's perhaps two different definitions here. One is the sort of boring academic political science version of what we define as an elite. And I think perhaps the more interesting one is the one you were touching on, which is what do ordinary citizens think of when they think of elites? And I think a lot of just ordinary folks would think, academics are elites. Perhaps it's true that they are. In political science, we don't really think of them as elites. But I do think that academia is certainly something that's used by politicians for certain reasons, largely on one side of the divide. So yeah, I mean, I do think what any individual American thinks of when they hear the word elites is going to vary from person to person.
So one of my like most polar or crystallizing thought process on elites came from a debate in Iowa a couple weeks ago, it was a month ago, where the candidate was asked, what is the break-even price of soybeans?
Yeah, Joni
And
Ernst couldn't do it.
Viral.
Yeah.
Because like this candidate in Iowa couldn't identify the break-even price in soybeans, and it was like this big thing, but it was like a gotcha moment that like, see, she's not one of us.
So this is a big thing. People are always afraid that they are going to, quote, go Washington and sort of get out of touch with their district, or if we're talking about a senator, get out of touch with their state. And so this is Joni Ernst, a Republican senator, didn't know the break-even price, and her challenger, Teresa Greenfield, could tell you exactly what it was. And so it was this sort of classic moment of you're out of touch with the people you're supposed to represent. This makes you look bad. And I think even Republican strategists, it might be in sort of whispered tones, but I think even these people would admit that, yeah, that wasn't great that she couldn't answer that question.
I'm pretty sure the Iowa Farm Bureau even pulled their support of the candidate.
Really?
I
yeah.
think so.
It's not great. It's every state has its thing that you kind of have to sort of be an expert on, or really sort of, cultivate support. And losing the ag community in the state of Iowa is, I think that the technical term is not ideal.
That's the technical term.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and so thinking about this like question of like what is an elite or what isn't an elite led me to what I put together, just a quick map of where you, me, and Alex are from. And this is a photo of downtown Ponca City. That's a historic district, actually, believe it or not. Did not know that. But
it's quite historic, man.
Yeah, so clearly. But I mean, if you look at this map, all of us are from kind of smaller towns in the middle of America. And so if we were still there, I don't think anybody would consider us to be the elites, right? But maybe people consider us to be elite now. I don't know.
I mean, again, this is a huge point of debate. I remember when I was in graduate school, we read a book, and the whole premise of the book is that elites, however we want to define them, sort of manipulate public opinion, and they just tell people what to think about things. And so we spent 3 hours arguing, are we elites? We're in academia. And so I'm not sure I have an answer after that 3-hour discussion. I'm still not sure if I have an answer about, precisely who elites are. But surely it's a good point,
Surely there's some cognitive dissonance there, because I think if you asked these people on the part of the map where my hometown is, by the way, Trey, can you point out on this map where my hometown is?
It's so far in the middle of nowhere that it just didn't make the map. It's underneath the middle thing, but I think it's in there, but like really it's Alex Schaefer is from the definition of flyover territory.
I'm so important to this podcast or whatever this thing is.
How many stoplights are in your hometown? That's the real question.
It's a very big place. Just neither of you guys have ever been there. It's a lot bigger than Ponca City. I'll tell you that right now.
Oh, I refuse to believe that. There's some fighting words right there.
Anyways, one, there's 4 words on this freaking page, and you couldn't get my hometown to show up above those 4 words. And second, probably...
I love the state of Kansas, but I'm sorry, Garden City just does not make the cut.
Whatever. My point was, I think that if you went and talked to people from Garden City, Kansas, there's going to be some cognitive dissonance there. They say, is Alex Schaefer an elite? And they would say, no, he's one of us. And then
Yeah.
you would say, are professors at Michigan State the elite? And they would say, absolutely. They don't know what it is to live out here.
Yeah.
So
So I
the
think
elite is
there's
more of an enigmatic, ambiguous boogeyman thing rather than a clearly defined thing, even in individual people's mind, I guess.
So there's two things there though. So your story you just told, the common thread between them was you, right? Like you didn't change. What changed was how you referred to yourself. And so this is an issue of framing, right? Am I Alex from Garden City or am I Alex the Michigan State professor? Right. And so I think the frame in which somebody or some issue is presented does a lot in determining how people view that thing. And so we see this in terms of, specific policies in front of Congress all the time. So that's one thing. I think one of the mechanisms driving the sort of negative views among elites is this sort of growing notion of populism, right? Where it's going to be, the sort of common man, all together, and we're going to sort of defend ourselves, or we're going to have someone defend us from these elites who are sort of, running the world in these Machiavellian ways, who are, not really looking out for us. And so I think, populism is a growing thing throughout the world. Not only in the US, but I think, this idea of framing has long been important for understanding why Americans think the things that they do.
But I mean, clearly you think that it's important. If that's literally the second chapter of your book, is that like there's been some type of polarization that's happening even with the elites. Is that?
Yeah.
fair?
So, I mean, political scientists are just about, the same as any group of academics. There's, debates and disagreement. But one thing that political scientists largely agree on is that political elites, so here defining elites as elected officials, have become more polarized over time. So Republican members of Congress have become more conservative. Democratic members of Congress have become more liberal. And so this is one of the reasons that it's sort of a kind of depressing thing to look at Congress, right? Nothing gets done because there's really, no overlap between Democrats and Republicans. And so it's increasingly difficult to have any sort of bipartisan compromise because of this polarization at the elite level.
Is that what is the causal kind of story there? I wonder, in my own mind, I can think of, you could have somebody that's kind of level-headed, kind of independent at the able to see both sides, and that's kind of a boring story. Whereas if you got somebody that's up in arms and passionate about whatever thing, that's a lot funner to listen to and to get behind than somebody that's kind of neutral in evaluating things.
Yeah, I mean, the causal mechanism of polarization is, basically a 20-year debate that you've just accidentally waded into. So congrats on that one. There's this really big
20 years too late. Yeah, great
Yeah,
question.
yeah. You could have been publishing in some of the best political science journals about 20 years ago, Alex.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's unclear. I think a lot of this is sort of a circle, and so it's hard to know where to start and where something ends. I think anger among the mass public sort of holds our elected officials' feet to the fire, right? We're saying, don't compromise with that side. I'm angry at them. I don't want you to work with, quote, the enemy, right? And so then we see nothing happen in Congress. It's sort of a hollowing out of our legislative process. This lack of progress only further makes us angry. And so it's just sort of a vicious cycle of mutually reinforcing negativity. So, I think every talk I've done, at some point, somebody said, man, that's really depressing. Yes, it is. Right. I mean, like we've got jackets made if you guys want to join the club. But yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where I think, the elected officials feed off of our anger and our antipathy, and we sort of observe this bickering and this sort of, vitriol at the elite level, and that just makes things worse for us. And so it really is sort of a vicious cycle.
So this is maybe a dumb question, but it's one of those things that in like almost every intro class to political economy, somebody explains median voter theorem, where like, you know what I mean? Like that's like one of those like standard things that if you've ever taken like a political science class, somebody probably is going to bring up median voter theorem. Does polarization or American rage, does that kind of blow up median voter theorem?
That's a great question. I don't know if you realize how good of a question that really is. So you should switch fields if Ag Econ
Dang
doesn't
it!
work out
Is
for you.
Trey
Yeah.
20 years ahead of me?
He is. He
Yeah,
is. You know,
basically.
for a minute there,
Not
I thought
hard.
Alex was going to be the token political scientist, and now it's Trey. So, you know, that's a great question. People have debated the median voter theorem, you know, ever since, you know, Downs sort of popularized this in the late 1950s. And, you know, I don't think it's really the case that parties converge on the median voter. And there could be lots of reasons why that is the case. Part of this is you got to think about the median voter among the subset of people who do vote, right? Which is going to look different from the median sort of potential voter. You know, I also think that the sort of structure of primary elections in this country have sort of polarized the two parties, because increasingly we see that it's the most extreme candidate that wins because so many districts are just uncompetitive between the two parties. So in that sense, it's not really a sort of race to the middle, but it's a march to the extremes. I don't think my book really does a whole lot to undermine the median voter theorem. If it does, then it was an accident. It was certainly not my intent. But I do think. Go ahead.
Like I actually wrote, like when I was reading that second chapter, I actually wrote like, what does this do to median voter theorem? But like again, like my knowledge of political science stops at the intro level, so like I don't really. I don't know.
It's so tricky too when you think about the median voter. Like, what are the issues that are salient for them that they're going to act on? Right, that might be different from another. It's like, as much as we have these sort of unidimensional models of politics, and as useful as they are, you know, there's lots of things that they miss as well. I don't think it's really easy or perhaps advisable to collapse politics down to just a single left-right dimension. And I think that's probably increasingly true, right? We see a sort of nativist versus global approach that sort of, you know, intersects with a left-right ideological division. So I think it's difficult. I think the sort of broader approach to my field, you know, we kind of take these sort of economic approaches as a straw man and attack them. So I don't know how many political psychologists will admit that, but I will happily admit that we sort of, you know, take Downs and Riker and sort of probably they say things that they don't actually say.
I mean, I'm a behavioral economist. I do that to like all economics.
Good. Then, you know, I'm in friendly territory then. But, you know, I think a lot of these people say, you know, like emotions, that doesn't matter. Like, people are rational and they're fully informed. And I think the sort of broad point of my work is, you know, people aren't always rational. And a lot of times they're not logical and they're guided by emotion. And, you know, that has some real consequences for our politics.
Okay, so you said guided by emotion, but one thing that you've done some work on is that they're also guided by their geography or at some level, right? Or that there is some type of residential sorting that we talk about all the time, where like Obama won most of the counties with a Whole Foods, but Trump won most of the counties with a Cracker Barrel.
For sure.
And there's like this geography conversation that's going on, as well as the emotional conversation. So here's a map that I stole from Ben Weingard down at Hillsdale, and this is a precinct level map of 2016 here in the state of Michigan. It's a pretty interesting map because I mean the blue is basically all the cities. So can you talk us through your research on that area?
Yeah. So this map, by the way, you would find similar patterns in just about any state, right? I mean, it's very much the case that Democrats are clustered in these sort of urban areas and Republicans are in more, you know, exurban and rural areas. And there's a lot of important implications of this fact. So one is that, you know, it's basically the case that Republicans are more efficient in terms of voting, especially when we're thinking about the House of Representatives. So Republican members of Congress largely come from districts that they won by a couple of percentage points. A lot of Democrats get elected, you know, winning by 70 points. And that's just because, you know, when you're in a city like Detroit or Atlanta or New York City, you have a lot of Democrats, but Republicans are spread geographically in a more efficient manner. So you can get more Republicans in Congress. And so that's one of the implications of the sort of geographic dispersion of Americans. This particular paper that you have on the screen was with just an absolutely brilliant colleague of mine who's now out at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And we wanted to know, do Americans sort geographically based off of their partisanship? So if I'm a Republican, do I want to go live near other Republicans and vice versa? Because there's this sort of notion popularized by people like Bill Bishop, these sort of journalistic accounts, that there's this big sort going on. And we find that, people do like to live near co-partisans, but this is like a very small preference. By and large, people want to live, in places that have good schools and are safe. A lot of times they're choosing to live in places that have things that correlate with partisanship. So Democrats like to be able to walk to bars and coffee shops. Republicans like, wide open spaces and sort of the freedom to move around. And so it's not the case that people are sorting explicitly on partisanship, but rather it's that they're sorting on things that go with partisanship.
What about ethnicity? I think is a big driver there. That surely it's no secret there is a big partisan divide in kind of ethnicity, and then you look at probably some political science, but certainly economic literature on your choice of what neighborhood and who your neighbors are, and sort of
you talking about Schiller?
Natural, I don't know names, but natural segregation driven by some of those choices seems like sort of the same story.
It is. There's been a racial realignment of the two parties over time. And the result of this has been that the Republican Party is largely white Americans. The Democratic Party is much more a coalition of racial minorities. And so to the extent we think that there's racial sorting in terms of geography, that's just another thing that's going to correlate with partisanship. I should say that the really interesting thing here is that, we argue that people aren't sorting in terms of their partisanship, but it remains true that we see figures like this map of Michigan, right? There's a clear geographic divide here, right? There's a red area and there's a blue area. And so the question has to be, well, then what is it if people aren't sorting geographically? And the answer that we offer is that places shape people more than people sort into places. So if I move to a Republican area over time, I'm going to become more conservative. And if I move to a Democratic area, I'm going to become more liberal. And the way we test this is actually look at people and their decision to update their registration, right? So if somebody moves to a more Democratic area, they're more likely to re-register as a Democrat and vice versa. And so it's sort of a social influence story rather than a story about selection effects.
Is that true both sides? I can see that going from when you talk about rural to urban migration. I can see that going from kind of Republican to Democrat. That's also a lot of kind of coming of age stuff and the changing demographics of maybe millennials. Right. Is that true outside of that story? Like, I mean, like the other way. So if someone goes from an urban to a rural area, does that happen that people then change from Democrat to Republican?
Yeah, so we didn't really find any sort of heterogeneous effects here, where it's the case that urban to rural matters more than rural to urban. And I want to be clear. I don't think so. I think social influence matters a lot, and I think the people we surround ourselves with, do quite a bit to shape our opinions. But it's not clear to me that this is always the biggest driver of why somebody's a Democrat or a Republican. I think the main point of our paper is simply to say that people don't appear to be sorting explicitly on partisanship. I think there's bigger reasons why somebody might change their partisan affiliation. Interestingly, this idea of party switchers, there's a real distinction between your partisan registration and your partisan identity, because a lot of times those are very different. Right? It's usually your registration that's the last thing to change. Usually the way you think of yourself changes before you change your registration. So I may be registered as a Democrat even if I really think of myself as a Republican.
Well, that gets us into our next step in the conversation, which is your personality relationship between the Big Five and partisan effect in polarized U.S. politics, which is another really good paper, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
But the storyline that you're talking through here is that like there's like this emotional personal change that's related to the people that you engage with, but it's not necessarily entirely driven by those people. It's also driven by these other things that are going on in the psychology behind people, right?
Yeah, I do think there's something inherent about human beings that make them, more or less likely to, for lack of a better way to put this, just sort of loathe the other side. And so what I'm showing here is I'm trying to predict, who is a negative partisan. So it's this idea that I've worked a lot on with my co-author, Alan Abramowitz, arguing that American politics and American political behavior is largely driven by the sorts of parties and candidates we don't like rather than the parties and candidates we do like. So it's not the case that American politics is, a story of I'm a Democrat because I like the Democrats. It's I'm a Republican just because I hate the Democrats, not because I really like the Republican Party. And so I wanted to know on a sort of micro level, who are these people that hold these attitudes? And so what I found here is that there are some, inherently personal things that predict this, these personality traits. So, those who are more extroverted are less likely to be motivated by these sort of negative views. Presumably, this is because extroverted people are able to get out in the world and sort of learn about people who have different viewpoints. They sort of expand their knowledge and they realize that perhaps there isn't the need to be so antagonistic as you might think.
Isn't that the opposite of what I just maybe don't know anything. I thought that the extrovert was Trey, who just talks all the time and doesn't do any of the listening. Is that not right?
It could be. I think even if you're talking all the time, you're still exposing yourself to more people. And so there's a greater chance that you are going to hear something. As to, Trey's unique personality profile, that's, I don't know if he wants to like lay on his,
is a spicy way to put that, man.
Yeah. If he wants to like lay on his couch, we can have a therapy session or something. I can pretend to know what I'm talking about here.
Well, I think it's an interesting point though, because like, yeah, I do talk a lot, but I believe it or not, I also just like engaging with people. So I actually enjoy hearing different takes so long as they're rooted in some type of, I think, honest, open debate. And so I'm a little surprised that the relationship between extroversion and like the size of the effect, because that looks like a big effect size relative to the other parameters. But I'm not that surprised by my extroversion being negatively related to negative partisanship.
Yeah, I think the
Am I
key thing is
that correctly.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's absolutely right. I think the more interesting thing for me is that like conditional upon being a negative partisan, how negatively do you view the other party as a function of your agreeableness, right? So people who are more just dispositionally prone to being agreeable are less antagonistic towards the other party. Now, unfortunately, this figure you have on the other side of the screen, I think is troubling for a lot of reasons. And these are some figures that I talk about in my book. It's increasingly true that partisans have some nasty stereotypes about the other side, right? So, Republicans are saying, that Democrats are unpatriotic, right? Democrats are saying Republicans are closed-minded. People are saying they're immoral, right? And so I think it's hard to sort of meet each other on a level playing field and fairly learn about the other side when we have these stereotypes that are sort of just baked into our worldview.
How much? So you said earlier on that it's not reasonable to characterize politics as a two-party system. I think I understood you correctly.
Ooh, that's not what I said at all.
Okay, go explain more carefully.
So,
I guess.
I mean, if I said that was a mistake.
I'm a beginner here.
I believe what I said is that I don't think it's fair to collapse politics onto a unidimensional scale. So I don't think we can just think of like liberals versus conservatives. I think there's other dimensions that sort of intersect with this left-right divide. So it could be things like insider versus outsider, sort of populist versus globalist, right? And so I don't think it's always just a ideological liberal versus ideological conservative. I think some of that is new to the Trump era, right? Trump has sort of redefined in some ways what it means to be a Republican. And so I think he's perhaps introduced a new dimension to American politics. But this figure here from the Pew Research Center is fascinating. And I did a lot of work in my book trying to explain why people have these attitudes. And so in one chapter of my book, I ran this experiment on people where I randomly made people angry. And I found that anger actually causes people to adopt these attitudes, right? So when people are angry at the other party, they're more likely to say that those who disagree with me are less intelligent than I am. So that 36 and 38 figure, I've shown that that's driven by anger. I've found that when people are angry at the other party, they're more likely to say that they're a threat to the country's well-being, which is kind of scary to think about from just the health of, our democracy. I've also found that when people are angry, they're more likely to say that concern for minority opinions is slowing political progress in the country. And so whatever side of the divide you happen to be on, I think we can all agree that these are not great attitudes for Americans to hold if we're really going to sort of do anything together, anything of consequence. And so in a lot of ways, the story of my book is that anger is this sort of corrosive aspect of American politics, not only at sort of the level of, legislating, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, at the level of the mass public.
Dude, so before we started going live here, you were explaining to me the difference between anxiety and anger. And I guess given the fact that we've got a whole bunch of stuff going wrong in the world right now, the world is burning down literally. We've got a pandemic, we've got riots in the streets, and a whole bunch of other stuff. How do I separate those issues of anxiety from the anger, and maybe then how do they play off each other in the current moment?
Yeah, so they're very similar. They're both what we would call negatively valenced emotions. So they're both negative, which is the first thing to note about them. And that's different from, positively valenced emotions like happiness or joy or contentment. Because they're both negatively valenced emotions, they tend to go hand in hand, right? If I design an experiment to make you angry, it's going to be the case that I elicit a residual amount of anxiety. If I was running an experiment to make you anxious, I would elicit a residual amount of anger. You can't entirely separate them. What we know from psychology and also from some political science research is that anger and anxiety have very different behavioral implications. So when people are anxious, they tend to do a few things. One thing is that they tend to seek out information because they want to try to learn about the world and figure out how to sort of calm their anxieties. They're also more likely to support candidates who offer sort of authoritarian type policies, right? Because they want to be protected from the thing that's making them anxious. And so they're sort of willing to make this trade-off of, I don't care if this sort of violates my civil liberties. I just want to be protected because I'm afraid of this thing out there that's, coming to get me or whatever it might be. When you're angry, you do the opposite of these things. So you don't seek out new information. You rely on the things you already know. You rely on simple cues or heuristics when making judgments. And so in American politics, this means I listen to what, my fellow Democrats say or my fellow Republicans say, and I just sort of accept that as, gospel truth, right? There's no reason to look for anything else. When you're angry, you tend to be more punitive, right? You want to do something or some set of things to sort of assuage your anger, particularly against that which you perceive to have elicited your anger. So they're very similar, but it's the different behavioral implications is why people tend to study these things separately.
So just as a point here, I don't know if you saw the Saturday Night Live a couple weeks ago when they were making fun of the separate town halls, but they characterized Trump as this, like you say, authoritarian thing. And then on the other side, they characterized Joe Biden as the Mr. Rogers character. Right. And so I'm sure you remember that. Do those two sentiments play with your separation of when I'm anxious, I want authoritarianism versus when I'm angry, I want, sorry, I said that opposite, but
you're fine.
The two distinctions that you're talking about.
So, I think, both parties try to elicit both anger and anxiety for different reasons. and sometimes it's hard to say which is which. And so somebody asked me about this a couple of days ago, and I brought up the issue of immigration. Right. So people are anxious about immigration. They're afraid that, somebody's going to come take their job or do something. But they're also angry because, people have stories of somebody lost this job or there was outsourcing and, now my family has to sort of regroup or figure out what's going on. And so I think a lot of times anxiety and anger are sort of elicited at the same time. I think the thing that I find most puzzling is this sort of portrayal of Joe Biden as a Mr. Rogers, as if he's this really happy guy.
Did you see that episode?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've been asked this question a lot too. Like, it seems like only Trump is trying to appeal to anger, and I just don't believe that at all. I think part of the reason Biden doesn't have to appeal to anger as much as Trump does is because Democrats were already angry at Trump. They've been angry at Trump ever since he took office. And so he has less work to do in terms of sort of engendering anger among his base. But I mean, Biden and affiliated Democratic groups are trying to make Democrats angry at Trump and all the things he's done and, the impeachment. Trump is trying to say that Joe Biden is, a Trojan horse for the left, and you should be angry that they're coming to, socialize everything. So both sides are doing it. I just think Biden is perhaps, sort of more surreptitious in how he does this, and he sort of outsources his anger to affiliated groups.
I buy that, yeah.
But both Democrats and Republicans are trying to appeal to this strategy. So I don't know, this portrayal of Joe Biden as Mr. Rogers, I've always found to be a bit disingenuous.
So one thing that I think is really interesting, especially talking about these like left right on Saturday Night Live, especially juxtaposed next to this Pew Research Center figure, is that the variation between parties here is not very different. And so it kind of leans into this stereotype of misconception problem where people want to put people in buckets based on what their party is. But it's not so easy as just to like say, well, this person is going to be gluten sensitive because he's a liberal.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work that way.
This is definitely true. So I also have some work on this showing that Democrats and Republicans tend to misperceive the nature of the other party. So, Republicans are more likely to say that, every Democrat is, an electric car driver who shops at Whole Foods and is an atheist and hates America, right? Democrats are more likely to say that, all Republicans are NRA members who go to church, 9 days a week and, all these things, right? And of course, neither of those are true. They're stereotypes. But the problem is that both sides increasingly believe those stereotypes to be true, and they're not. And these sort of misperceptions also feed into this antipathy that both sides have for each other.
I mean, to me, the perfect example just happened this last week in the New York Times, where they had like a quiz of like, look at this refrigerator. Is this a Republican refrigerator or a Democrat refrigerator?
This is a board reporter somewhere who's like, hey, I've got a great idea. I don't know what editor green lit that, but my word.
But I mean, but that's exactly like, oh, we don't even eat the same food at this point.
Yeah.
At
least
it's
like, do you see kombucha in somebody's fridge versus, a 2 liter of Coke or something, right? It's just but again, this kind of goes back to this idea of, some of the things that were underpinning the geographic sorting study is that these things tend to correlate with partisanship to varying degrees, but there is some relationship there.
So we've got 10 minutes to talk about the future of the world.
Oh man.
So I wanted to highlight this paper, especially because it's probably your like most famous paper.
Yeah.
But this paper, what year did this come out? Is it on there?
2016.
Okay. So you wrote this before
Trump.
Seemed like it blew up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet at that point in time, you could still find this like increase in negative partisanship.
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with what we could expect afterwards? Do you think maybe just post-Trump, everything's going to be awesome? Or maybe if Trump gets elected, things are going to be different? Or what does the world look like going forward?
More acrimonious and more divided. And I think that's,
hold on. You've got to define that word for me. What the heck does acrimonious mean?
I don't know. I just made it up. It's not a real word. No, I am not optimistic that, whether it's a re-election for the president or whether Joe Biden wins, I don't think we're going to snap back to a world, whether it's real or imagined, where, everyone gets along and, there's no divisions. I think the trends of negativity and antipathy have been building for so long, and the causes of these things are so multifaceted that the election or re-election of one man is not going to do anything to change these trends. This is a systemic problem, and so I think it's going to take sort of some sort of system-wide readjustment if we're going to fix this growing antipathy in American politics.
Oh, but hold on, that doesn't seem like an answer at all. Who is it that fixes this system? If the problem of the system is even at the level of the president and the Congress.
So it's tricky. This is why I'm pessimistic. So for instance, one of the real frustrations among at least half of the country right now is the system of the Electoral College, right? Whatever you think of the Republican Party, it has only won the popular vote once since Ronald Reagan's time as president, right? It won it in 2004. That's interesting because the Republicans have been in control of the White House since then. They've appointed Supreme Court justices. They have a lot of people in the Senate. And so a lot of people are upset that, repeatedly, the president has not won the majority of the votes cast in this country. And so one of the arguments is, well, can we sort of reform the Electoral College to make it a fairer system and thereby reduce this animosity? It's not likely, right? I mean, I can't imagine a world where we could have a constitutional amendment to do anything right now. Least of which because of the Electoral College is a very important institution for, particularly the Republican Party right now. They're the beneficiary of this. And so they have no incentive to change a system that's working for them. And so then people will say, well, okay, could we do something outside of amending the Constitution? And so you'll hear things about this sort of interstate compact and say, states are going to mutually agree to only give their votes to the candidate that wins the popular vote.
Good luck
there's
with
no
that.
there's no strategic reason for a state to do that, right? California doesn't want to risk its votes going to a Republican. Texas doesn't want to risk its votes going to a Democrat. And so no state can credibly commit to doing this. And so that's what I'm saying is on any issue that is, significant and is really sort of, kind of a flashpoint in American politics, I don't think we can get any sort of bipartisan consensus to do anything. And so a more recent example for you, Joe Biden has talked about how if he wants to get reelected, he wants a bipartisan commission to study the federal judiciary, right? There's all these concerns now about the Supreme Court.
On half of the equation, yeah.
Why in the world would Republicans ever agree to sit on that commission?
Yeah.
And if they did, they would say, no, it's fine. And the reason they would say it's fine is because they're benefiting from it now. So this is what I mean when I say I'm not optimistic about American politics, right? Sides have issues that they benefit on. They don't want to give up those benefits. The mass public is angry and they're dug in, so they're not going to tolerate any compromise among elected officials. And so no one has an incentive to actually do the things that need to get done if we're actually going to make progress on really any issue.
So if this trend of acrimoniousity continues,
photosynthesis, same thing.
photosynthesization continues.
This is an ag podcast, right? This is about the extent of my agricultural knowledge.
Where does that lead us? I mean, do we just follow this trajectory until all of our heads explode? Surely there is some not linear relationship until the end of time.
I hope not. I think the times in which we've been able to do things, big things on a bipartisan manner, have been a result of other bad things and things that you wouldn't wish upon our country or any country. So, in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks, we saw a lot of bipartisan support, right? George W. Bush is the most popular president of all time.
For 25 minutes.
Yeah, and it was because of 9/11. There was this sort of rally around the flag effect. But no one would wish a 9/11 attack on us again so that we could do something. I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
Well,
So,
but hold on. I mean, we're in the middle of probably the most defining moment in all of our lives right now.
There is no they for this, though. There is no us versus them.
So that's a key point that Alex makes up, right? We were attacked by Al Qaeda, and we had a notable sort of enemy here. This COVID response has really illustrated the depths of what we call partisan motivated reasoning, which is the idea that partisans view the world through their sort of blue or red shaded lenses. In every situation, there's a fact, right? There's a true sort of position on things. Like there are X number of deaths due to COVID or whatever it is we're talking about. And yet we know Democrats and Republicans have had very different responses to this pandemic. And in fact, there's been some really interesting work showing that the single biggest predictor of whether one wears a mask is their partisan affiliation. And this is largely due to signals and cues sent from elected officials, right? There's really no Democrat saying, don't wear a mask, right? They're all saying, wear a mask. You've got a lot more sort of conflicting advice on the Republican side about whether you should wear a mask or not. Notably, the president has been very sort of, unclear. It's probably the most charitable thing I could say about it on whether somebody should wear a mask. And so, Republicans are less likely to wear a mask than Democrats because Republican elites, there's that word again, are telling people in the public different things than what Democratic elites are. And so there's a real partisan divergence here.
So this really matters living here in Michigan, because when I think about like partisanship, you made the example of like Texas and California or whatever, and like we can kind of put like Oklahoma is obviously going to vote very different from California or New York or whatever. But like when I think about like Michigan, I mean, it's a purple state for a reason. But figures like this make me think that even Lansing is going to have a lot of issues with passing any type of anything.
It's tricky. The virus does not respect the boundaries of a congressional district or a county, right? And so you could live in, one county that's, shutting everything down, but if the surrounding counties aren't doing any sort of mitigation efforts, well, that's going to spill over and affect you. And so, I think some of these things sort of require national solutions rather than, frankly, some of the piecemeal solutions we've seen in our federal system.
We've got 2 minutes left, and at the moment in this conversation, the world is burning to the ground and there is nothing to save us. Is there any kind of bright side to look on here? Or are you just gonna leave us like this?
So, I will say that, despite this anger that we have, I think one of the positives here is that Americans are participating in politics more. And that's a great thing. People are standing in line to vote, rain or shine, doesn't matter how hot or cold it is. And so it's a good thing that Americans are participating in the political process. And so I think that's one of the things, not only due to anger, but due to polarization. Right? Polarization gives us a clearer choice between candidates. It makes it easier for us to say, this is the person I support, or that's the person I support. I will also say that my research shows that anger does not appear to want to, it's not the case that we're angry and therefore we want to get rid of democracy, right? We're still committed to, everyone should have a say, everyone should have a voice. So, I don't think it's the case that, the world is going to burn completely because of our anger. I think the key thing is finding ways to channel our anger in healthy and useful ways. And I think that's perhaps what we're missing right now.
What does that look like? That sounds really interesting. Oh, Trey found a book.
Well, no, it's his book.
Okay.
I've seen that book before.
Okay, so I'm on like page 147. You talk about how like in 1997, 12% of people were angry at the federal government, and that number has jumped to 22% now. And so like, I mean, it's almost double what but that's the federal government. Like it's this nebulous thing. It wasn't like Republicans or Democrats. It's just the average American is far more angry at the federal government. That does not inspire confidence. And so, on top of that, like, how do we reverse that trend? Is there a way? Is there a way for me to be less angry?
Channel our anger. He's saying we're using our
I'm
anger for good.
Read the last paragraph of my book and you'll know my thoughts, because they're not optimistic, right? It's I would love to have written a book where the last page is like, hey, by the way, everything's going to be fine. No need to worry. We've got this. The book I wrote is a lot more pessimistic than that. In fact, the last sentence in my book is, we have reason to be worried.
Yeah.
So
that's great. But I mean, from an individual perspective, let's say like, I don't want to be part of the problem here.
Okay.
How do I try to tone down my negative partisanship?
So, I think one thing that makes us angry and makes us frustrated is the sort of lack of progress at the national level. And I think, that might be part of the problem, is that too often we're focused on national politics. It turns out that the sorts of things that government does that affect us the most happen at the most local level, right? Do we get this pothole fixed? Is our trash picked up on a regular basis? Are our streets cleaned? Right. And so I think really getting involved in sort of local politics where you can affect the most change will probably make you feel better both about yourself and the world. It'll increase your sense of political efficacy, right? You'll feel better about the system. I think trying to get, any sort of progress at the national level is like pushing a boulder up a hill. You're just not going to make any progress. But it's easier to do things at the more local level. And so I think that's where a lot of our attention should be focused.
So your advice here is the serenity prayer.
It's just
accepting the things you can't change and changing the things you can.
the political serenity prayer. Yeah. I mean, but think about this. Like, unless one party has complete control in Washington, we're unlikely to see anything really happen. And frankly, even when there is entire
sounds like
control,
it might be worse for half of the population.
Yeah, but even then, it's not a guarantee, right? You got to think, there was a period where Republicans had the White House, the House, and the Senate, and they could not repeal the Affordable Care Act. They've been wanting to do this for a decade, and divisions within the party prevented them from doing that. So even in like the most likely case, it's still not a guarantee. So I mean, national politics is important. Don't get me wrong. It's what I study, but I do think you're more likely to get things done at more local levels.
That's some good concluding advice. We really appreciate you coming on, man. This was
hey man, it's
really
good to be here.
So interesting. I had a great time.
You're smarter than Aleks. I would almost say you're smarter than I am, but
I don't know about that, man. Listen, you guys know more about politics than I do about agriculture. So
would you mind telling me what is the break-even price for soybeans?
Listen, I'm not Joni Ernst. I don't have to answer that question, right?
Because if you can't answer it, I'm going to disregard everything you've said.
Yeah, right.
All I know is I go to the grocery store and I find things there that I can buy. So that's about it for me.
Testament to the system during a pandemic, I will say.
That's
it's
right,
pretty
man.
Incredible.
It's wonderful.
So, well, awesome. Well, Stephen, thank you very much for coming on. If anybody's really interested in the topic, I definitely recommend the book just because there's so many nuggets in there. And for any academics that are watching, it's like full of like cited, like peer-reviewed content too. So like I mean, I'm probably just going to steal all of your references for the articles that I write. So thank you for doing my literature review. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, man. When I wrote the book, I was thinking of Trey Malone and how can I best help Trey. So
you crushed it. Awesome.
Great.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.
See ya.
You guys.